You are living in a period of extreme geopolitical turbulence. Israel is at war with Hamas, Russia is at war with Ukraine, and today's guest believes that America is about to be at war with itself. In this interview, we cover chances of U.S. civil war, how you're being lied to, the major threats to democracy, the odds of World War III, the different ramifications between a Trump or Biden victory, AI, and more. So join me in welcoming political analyst Ian Bremmer. You've called this year the Voldemort of years because there are three wars that we're going to be talking about. We've got Israel-Hamas ongoing, we've got Russia-Ukraine ongoing, and we've now got the United States versus itself, which you've said could kick off at any moment. So what I want to ask is it really that bad? Like in modern day America, could we actually find ourselves in civil war?
No. In fact, since you're asking that question, I literally just a few moments ago responded to someone. It was David Rothkopf. I did not have full-fledged Civil War on my bingo card for 2024. I think I need a new bingo card. And I wrote, I would definitely stick with your old bingo card. So no. I understand that we have like 25 governors that are all lined up saying, got to defend the border and don't want to listen to the Supreme Court. This is not about civil war. This is about a democracy in crisis. This is about two sides that are very antagonistic towards each other. The stakes are very high, especially for the leaders of both of these political parties. And there is no effort to engage in diplomacy. There's no effort to see things from the perspective of the other side. And in fact, they really don't even share basic understanding of political facts. And when you look at that and you compare it to Russia versus Ukraine or Israel versus Hamas, then you start to see that there is a real line through of comparison. And that is unfortunate. It's not that we're going to start blowing ourselves up. It's more that we aren't capable of having a free and fair election that the entire country believes in anymore. And that's kind of foundational to a well-functioning democracy. But unfortunately, that's not where we are this year.
Okay. Definitely what I was hoping you were going to say, but now set the table for us. When I read the report that you put out, you list the United States against itself as the number one threat that we face. Why? Walk me through when you talk about, you've said social media is an existential threat to democracy. Obviously, we've got Trump versus Biden as the likely race. What are the pieces that are on this, maybe chessboard is a better analogy, that have you listing this as the number one concern?
Well, first, let me explain what it means to be number one. So what's the methodology behind my madness, right? What we're looking at, we're measuring likelihood, imminence, and impact. And so, I mean, if you look at this year's report, Africa's not in it. Why not? I mean, all sorts of horrible things that are really risky are happening in Africa, but the economic and diplomatic and security impact on the rest of the world is negligible. And I'm sorry to have to say that, but it is what it is. Like I can't make it other than what it is. And where in the United States, the fact that the U.S. democratic process is pretty broken and that is having a significant impact on policies that the U.S. enacts with massive implications for the rest of the world, because the U.S. is by far the strongest economy in the world. It's by far the strongest military in the world. Like that's why there's such outsized impact from the United States. It's a big deal. So, for example, Trump has not yet got the nomination. He will, right? I mean, I think that's pretty much 100% short of a really unforeseen health event. There's really no mechanism for anyone to get, for Nikki Haley to get a single state. I expect that she'll drop out before South Carolina because she's not going to want to lose her home state by 30 points. I think she's politically savvy enough to avoid that fate. But even before Trump gets the nomination, just by putting his thumb on the scale and saying, I don't want a deal on the border in return for $61 billion of Ukraine aid because I want to run on that issue against Biden, who's failing on the border right now. And Mitch McConnell, who is no Trump fan, but is now loyal because Trump now owns the Republican Party again, gets on board. And the Speaker of the House gets on board. And so what happens to Ukraine? You're not getting that 61 billion. So is that a risk of Ukraine or is that a risk of the United States? Oh, that's a risk of the United States. And, I spend a lot of my time talking to leaders of different governments around the world. They are maximally concerned about this. Chinese leadership, far more concerned about the U.S. election than the election in Taiwan, for example, where so many people were saying, oh, it could be war, it could be confrontation. No, they're worried about the U.S. The Europeans are worried about the U.S. The Mexicans and Canadians are worried about the U.S. So that's why there are such major knock-on implications from this election.
All right. When they say they're worried, what is the doomsday scenario for people? So there's, assuming that you're right, Trump is going to be running against Biden. One of the two is going to win. If you were to play out the scenarios, one, let me ask you, if the election were held today, who would win?
I'd say Trump would win today fairly handily. I would say in November right now, my view is 60-40 Trump. But I have very low confidence in saying that because there's so much that can happen in the next 9 months.
Fair. Okay, so let's run those scenarios. Talk to me about the lead up, because that's the thing I think is a huge litmus test. If you were to ask me what I've spent the most time thinking about, it's what does it look like in a world with AI at the level that it's at in an election that is so contentious and so high stakes globally? What does that look like? But then also, I want to specifically walk through the scenarios of what does the world look like, say, in the immediate 6 months after a Trump victory? What does the world look like in an immediate 6 months after a Biden victory?
Well, so first of all, the stakes are so much higher for these individual leaders. If Trump loses, he's going to jail. And I mean, we've got 91 indictments. There will almost certainly be convictions, at least in the Washington, D.C. case before the election, though he'll be out on bail. But so the stakes for Trump are far higher than they were before. That means the implications of him losing is something he needs to avoid at all costs. The efforts that he and many of his supporters will take to avoid that, and maybe even to interfere with that, are far greater than they would have been in 2020 or in 2016. And certainly the impact, if Biden wins, of Trump then going to jail and the government taking that action against him, after you will have heard the entire Republican Party saying that these cases are fake and they're politicized and they're trumped up and they're a witch hunt. And they will say that because they will all be loyal to and endorsing Trump, has the potential to have far more disruption from saying that the election was rigged. So assuming it's not a massive landslide where you can't get away with saying that, Trump would still say it, but that you can't, it doesn't make sense. Then, I do think there's a much greater likelihood that you will have civil disobedience, social instability, violence in a lot of red states, in a lot of red cities, and unwillingness to accept a Biden administration as legitimate president in 2025. I think that's a very big and real possibility. Now, if Trump wins, there are several things that are really different this time around from 2016. One thing that is different is his priorities. His first priority has to be to end all of the investigations against him, to politicize the DOJ and the FBI and the IRS that he believes are already politicized against him, and impose his own loyalists on those in the bureaucracies of those organizations, so that he can go after his enemies that want to lock him up. He's going to want to lock them up. And indeed, there are many senior advisors to Biden that feel like they're likely to be imprisoned if Trump is able to pull that off. So we're talking here something that looks a lot more like Peru or Hungary than looks like Canada or Japan or Germany, right? And we're normalizing all of this because, you know, we're getting used to it over a number of years. We're like, okay, well, now we have presidents that get impeached a couple of times, and the impeachment's kind of broken. It's only political. So, okay, that's the way it works. And, you know, we see what happened with the Speaker of the House, who's thrown out by a small number of caucusing members of his own party. And that means that you can't promote legislation that they don't like. That's the way it works now. That's not the way it's worked historically. And it's not the way a functional democracy works. But in this environment, if Trump wins, that is what we're looking at. And then there's also the international environment, which is very, very different. 2016 to 2020, there really weren't any major global crises going on while Trump was president. This time around, Trump will be president with a minimum of two major wars that are going on. And he's promised he will end the war in Ukraine on the first day. He says it's just a talking point. He says it all the time. What he means is that he will force the Ukrainians to accept the present delineation of land. And when they refuse, they will be cut off. They'll say, you get a ceasefire for that. Well, they say, no. This is an existential crisis for NATO and for the EU, because there are a lot of frontline countries that think that that is an unacceptable outcome. But there are others, like Hungary and Slovakia, as well as political movements inside Europe that are gaining in popularity, like the New National Front in France or like the Alternatives for Deutschland in Germany, that will be aligned with Trump, not with their governments. And Trump will reach out to them in directly engaged foreign policy, something that absolutely isn't happening right now under the Biden administration. And we've had for the last several years a very coordinated NATO and transatlantic relationship. This suddenly becomes an immediate crisis for the Europeans and for NATO. So, I mean, just to, you know, play out a little bit of what that means, that's some of what we should be thinking about. And it's certainly a lot of what American allies are thinking about as we head into this election season.
Okay, so I want to go back to the civil unrest. So if Biden is elected, what do you like? Let's use 2020 as our benchmark. So we had a lot of civil unrest in 2020. Having lived through it in LA, where a lot of it was popping off, it was serious. But certainly seeing that sort of move through the system, obviously we were nowhere near that spilling over into a civil war. That to me feels like peak sort of Tinder pile, given that we had all been locked down. And so there was just a sort of screaming sense of injustice everywhere. And then you get to January 6th, which I guess technically was 2021. And again, now we've been locked up even longer, and there's a real undercurrent of not only is there a massive amount of social injustice, but there's also the government may actually be becoming tyrannical. And so that felt like a powder keg moment that I don't feel like we will have in 2024's election, barring an economic turn. So if you had to gauge off of the instability that we had in that period versus what you expect after this election, if Biden wins, where do you peg that level of reaction?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think the global challenges are much greater than the domestic ones. So you mentioned the point, you know, barring an economic unforeseen issue in the U.S., performance of the U.S. economy is actually quite strong right now. Now, people don't necessarily feel that way because the leading indicator that determines how you feel about the economy in the U.S. is what your political affiliation is, which is senseless, but is true. And that gets to the problem of democracy, the, you know, completely different information environments. But you certainly do not have people locked down under the pandemic. You certainly do not have an economy that is in crisis. but other economies around the world are going to get hit very badly by this. This is a U.S. democracy in crisis is a much bigger problem for the economies in Europe, for example, or in Asia, for example, than they are for the United States. And that is, meaningful. But the risk report that we write is a global report. It's not just a report that looks at the United States domestically. So I do think it is the geopolitical backdrop of this instability and the erosion of political institutions in the United States that poses a big issue. I mean, remember, Trump came in last time around and he pulls the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This ends those negotiations, pulls the U.S. out of the Paris climate talks, pulls the U.S. out of the Iranian nuclear deal, all of these things, but they happen in peacetime. And so it doesn't really matter that much. That happens in wartime when people are feeling crises and when other countries are feeling major economic stress after 3 years of pandemic. That's a very different story. So if anything, this would make me more structurally bullish on the dollar and on the U.S. stock market, because in a world that is much more unstable, you're going to the cleanest dirty shirt. And that's not crypto, right? I mean, it's not NFTs. And it's certainly not China.
How dare you, Ian Bremmer?
I'm sorry. It's certainly not China, which is facing very serious, so serious economic challenges that they really don't want Trump. And they had no problem with Trump in 2016. And this time around, they're saying, we can't handle the chaos. We just want a stable election, So that is really interesting. I don't think there'll be another January 6th because everything will be locked down around that. The preparations for that will be in place. I think it's much more likely the kind of instability we'll see will be much more like what we had in Portland, Oregon. But again, in red states, where you have large numbers of disenfranchised MAGA types, who are many of whom are armed, many of whom will see a Biden administration as a second Biden administration as an absolute destruction of everything that they see as holy. And they will likely be supported by a lot of local police and maybe some local members of the armed forces. And that's a fairly serious impact, in my view. That's the biggest thing that I think is likely to come about in a relatively narrow Biden win. Where there will be massive information that people that oppose Biden will believe that the election was stolen and was stolen badly, and that disinformation will also be magnified by artificial intelligence, which we've already seen with those fake Biden robocalls in New Hampshire. Just the tip of the iceberg. There were voters that were told with a Biden voice, and they were targeted directly with their real phone numbers and their real names. You are not to go out. We don't want you to go and vote in the primary, because we want you to vote in the general election, not in the primary. That's artificial intelligence, real cheap, and there are lots of bad actors in the country and outside of the country that would love to foment chaos through those mechanisms.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. In my layman stance, were I putting out my report of risks, AI causing just a massive disinformation campaign in the buildup to the 2024 election, continuing to bifurcate people into different camps, where we don't share any facts. That is the thing that freaks me out, and I think that's going to get better before it gets worse. Sorry, that's going to get worse before it gets better. And yeah, so
but the reason that we put that in the U.S. risk and not in the AI risk is because it is the vulnerability of the U.S. and the willingness to believe conspiracy theories, the dysfunction and fragmentation of the political system that makes the U.S. election so singularly vulnerable to those sorts of attacks. Those attacks would not work in Japan. They would not work in Germany. Like, people would not go out onto the streets with pitchforks in response to that. In the United States, increasingly different.
That's interesting. Tell me more about that. Why are we more likely to be easily divided than Japan or Germany or anybody else?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of the Trump question. See, I don't see Trump as the principal risk. I see him as a symptom. So why is the United States the country that has elected Trump and now might elect him a second time? Why isn't that happening in other advanced industrial democracies? Why do the Americans talk about stop the steal and none of that happened? Even after Brexit in the UK, the domestic political system basically runs the same way. Why is that happening? And there are a lot of things that people talk about. They talk about inequality. They talk about identity politics, but those things exist, demographics changing. Those things exist in a lot of other countries, maybe not to the same degree. The US is more unequal economically today than the rest of the OECD, but not by a massive amount. Um, I think that the bigger issue is that the United States is the country where its social institutions have most eroded. So, I mean, the US is a country that historically has been by far the most religious and God-fearing. And yet, in the last 40 years, church membership has fallen off a cliff in the United States. Belief in the church, trust in the church has gone way down, just like belief in, in Congress. The belief in the public school system has gone way down in the US, just like belief in the judiciary. And I think that the fact that those institutions have really eroded in a country that is much more driven by individualism and entrepreneurship and unfettered capitalism, which has driven incredible growth in the US. And it's why the US is leading the world in AI and other countries are behind. I mean, we're the country with Elon Musk. And he wasn't even born in the US, but he knew that this was the place he could make it. And Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, we have those people. But we're also the one where so many Americans feel unmoored. They feel like nature got them. They've got genetics, but they don't have nurture anymore, whether it's the atomized family, or it's the lack of national service, or it's just the civic institutions all falling apart. And now, in the last 10 years, nurture has been replaced by something. It's been replaced by algorithms. And we're the country that has all the influencers. We're the countries where everybody wants to be a personal brand. But we're also the country that has so many of our young people wanting to engage in self-harm and even suicide, because they're spending all their time on social media where they're being algorithmically disintermediated from the rest of society and only engaging with people that they already agree with, or things that make them angry, both of which are great for the corporate business model, but are anathema to creating civic adults, to raising a nation that connects with each other. I think if I had to point to one thing that has really eroded American democracy, it would be that. I think that's
But
where the
social
US
media
is
is
most
everywhere.
vulnerable.
Are we just ahead of the curve,
Yes.
or do you think that there's something unique about either the cultural fabric of America or something else that has governmental policies that have made us more vulnerable than somebody else?
I think it's both. Okay, I mean, you see this happening. I mean, Canada, it's definitely happening too. You saw Ottawa and the truckers' riots and Rebel News, and there's a lot of misinformation in Canada too. And democracy in Canada's eroded somewhat, nowhere near as much as the US. Japan, almost not at all. Sense of community in Japan is so much stronger. It's basically a single party democracy. There was a very interesting event in Japan that you may have seen. It was a couple of months ago. There was a Japan Airlines aircraft that hit I think it was a Japanese Coast Guard smaller plane that was routed right in front of where this plane was about to land or take off. And the plane caught on fire. 330 plus people, passengers, were on the plane. Every single one of them got off within like 5 minutes. And not only did they follow the instructions of the stewards and stewardesses, like literally immediately, not one of them took a bag off the plane because they were told not to. Now, yeah, that is inconceivable to me on a United flight. I mean, is it unpopular for me to say that some of this is cultural? I mean, am I going to get canceled for that? I travel to Japan all the time. I know that is different. I mean, the Americans, we're just a really individual oriented society. And so I do think that some of this is different. Some of this is actually unique to what makes Americans tick. And as a consequence, when the social contract starts eroding, and when the American political and economic system doesn't work as well for a lot of Americans, they feel left behind, they feel forgotten, it's going to hurt American society a lot more, right? Because that safety net, and some of that safety net is cognitive, some of that safety net is emotional, is just not there for people in a way that I think it is in a lot of other countries. I think it is in a more collectivist Germany, for example, than it is in the United States.
How often are you checking your credit score, afraid of identity theft or account breaches? We all use the internet every single day for important things like personal banking and remote work, so why not protect yourself with our sponsor, Aura? Aura is an all-in-one cybersecurity service that keeps you safe online. Aura identifies data brokers exposing your info and submits opt-out requests on your behalf. Aura also monitors your credit, tracks your passwords for data breaches, and secures your online activity with VPN and anti-malware protection. You can try Aura for free for 2 weeks by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code. Yeah, so if you're going to get canceled for that, let me join you in the cancellation. It is self-evident to me that culture plays a huge part in everything, just life, full stop, period, in general. When we talk about nature versus nurture, that's effectively what we're talking about. The nurture being the culture. It could be the culture of your family, the culture of your city, town, whatever, or the thing nobody is talking nearly enough about, the culture of the class that you were born into and thusly raised in. If I were to, and I admittedly have not thought about this before, so I'll be very interested to get your take on this, but as I was listening to you talk, the thing that jumped to mind as to why Japan, which I am just a literal Japanophile, I could not love them anymore. They are a hyper conservative culture. So I think that speaks a lot about that. They're also a more collectivist culture. You see yourself as integrated into the whole more than somebody that's going to stand out. What I think is happening in America right now, and again, I'm thinking through this in real time, is that we are an individualistic culture that has really done extraordinarily well with capitalism, but the Gini coefficient is real. And as the gap between the poorest among us and the richest among us grows wider, you are going to get people, even though by global standards, lower income people in America are still way better off than lower income people elsewhere. But it doesn't feel like that if you're broke and you are cleaning Jeff Bezos's third mega mansion. And so that reality is what I think we're watching play out now. And you have some people that are crying out for collectivism, and you have other people that are still staunchly individualistic. Now, you've talked about something I've not heard anybody else talk about, which is that one of the big concerns on the global stage for what's happening in America, the division in America and why it's so problematic, is all of a sudden identity politics is steering a lot of the policy and the sort of how you can expect America to behave versus economics. And previously, the rest of the world could just go, America's going to do whatever's in their economic best interest. Easy enough to predict. Cool. I know the script and I may hate it. I may be violently opposed, but at least it's predictable. Whereas now the instability inside of our own country is causing our politicians to really have to look inward, to be very cognizant of an increasingly divided constituency. And they now have to make policies that maybe are not economically the best policy, but they soothe the most people that vote for them.
Absolutely. I mean, industrial policy has become a much greater driver, and it doesn't matter if it's helping or hurting the American economy. And that's even true when you talk about American consumers and taxpayers. I mean, think about how many folks have been behind higher tariffs on Chinese goods. And Trump said, They're paying for that. They're paying for that. No, they're not. American consumers are paying for that. But it is politically completely toxic to talk about reducing tariffs against Chinese exports to the US. And it doesn't matter what the economic sensibility of that happens to be. And we can play that through in all. I'm all in favor of investing in American human capital and infrastructure. I think the CHIPS Act was great. I'm glad we're rebuilding bridges again. I mean, Lord knows we need to be, have a high-speed rail system. I'd like it to be private sector, but if the public sector can help make it happen faster, God bless. Those things are happening, but at the global level, the Americans are now politically throwing all sorts of wrenches into globalization. And in part, that's because a lot of Americans feel like they didn't benefit from globalization. So why should we support that? You're going to take my job and my livelihood and you're going to send it to China? Screw you. I'm not going to support that. And it is true that if the American economy grows like Topsy, but the middle class and the working class is treated like cannon fodder, then they're not going to be very interested in promoting your policy. So globalization is absolutely great for the United States, but globalism sucks for the average American. And that is where you see policymakers like Trump and Bernie Sanders, frankly, and AOC, it's both sides of the spectrum, making bank in this environment. Because people out there, so many people say the system doesn't work. They're lying to me. So I want someone who's going to break things. I want someone who's going to take the fight because otherwise it's never going to get fixed. And Trump is someone who, just by dint of the fact that he drives the establishment so insane, he drives the media so insane, he drives the political leaders so insane that that he's really fighting those guys. So if you really feel like things are broken in the US and the only thing you see is a small pocket of people that keep benefiting, it's never hitting you, you're willing to roll the dice on someone that's going to be a chaos agent. And Trump is that. Trump is that.
Is the system broken and are they lying to us?
I think that the American system in many ways is unrepresentative of the average American. I mean, just the fact that the U.S. is now, of all of the OECD economies, the U.S. is the country where you can best predict a person's wealth as an adult on the basis of their parents' wealth, more than any other OECD economy. And when you and I were kids, that wasn't true. That's a sign of a broken system. I thought that the Varsity Blues case, when we saw all of these entitled adults doing everything they could to make sure their kids were getting into Ivy League schools and thinking they were doing nothing wrong because that's the way the system works, that is, in my mind, the sign of an unrepresentative system. We see examples of that all the time. And I do think the fact that the average American doesn't trust their political institutions anymore is not the fault of the working class. That's the fault of the people that have been leaders. And it's not just a communications failure. It is an execution failure. They just haven't made it work for enough Americans. And people are taking advantage of that. And there's a lot of disinformation. And I do believe that, a number of policies we've seen in the last few years are going to move the needle over time. I was a big fan of the Inflation Reduction Act. And by the way, more red state jobs than blue state jobs under the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation. But that will take 10 or 20 years before it actually starts to change the way people think about their opportunities. It doesn't happen overnight, not when for 40, 50 years they've been on the wrong side of that. So, I do think that there are big things. You look at how much money there is in the American political system, the billions of dollars that are spent on election cycles that go for more than a year, and they are spending that money. And a lot of that money is dark money. We can't even find out who's behind it and where it's going. And we know that the purpose of that money is to perpetuate special interests in their ability to capture the regulatory process and make politicians work for them and not the average American. I mean, when we see things, even like the NRA, and we know that the average American wants a different policy, but it can't happen because there's too much money that pays to ensure that it doesn't. And that happens, by the way, with teachers unions and police unions too. And ensuring that the system is broken and doesn't work properly for their kids. Yeah, that is for me a sign of a system that is deeply sclerotic, that is unrepresentative. It's not completely unfunctional, and partially because we're so wealthy and we have so much entrepreneurship and we're in such a wonderful location geographically and we have so many natural resources. I mean, there's so many things that America has going for it that you can tolerate a lot of things that are really broken in your political system, and the country can still work. But honestly, is America's political system in crisis? Yes, I think it is. I think it is. And I say that as someone who has a lot of friends in government, Democrats and Republicans, who I think are trying to do the right thing. But the system is pretty broken right now. Yeah, I think it is.
All right. So are they lying to us?
Who's they?
People are going to say the elites, the government, mainstream media. We'll start there. Those two.
Uh, I think that a lot of the we must consume, the presumptions of what goes behind capitalism. Let me give you an example. You know how much young people care about climate. You know how much they care about the environment. They've been lied to. We've been lied to for decades by very, very powerful organizations that had a lot to lose by admitting that climate change was happening, that it was transformative in bad ways, and that they were responsible for it. Yeah. Are they lying to us? Yeah. And then, by the way, when they finally admitted it, they still did everything they could privately to prevent us from taking action that would have made this a lot cheaper to deal with, a lot less costly to deal with. Are they lying to us? Yeah. Did the tobacco companies lie to us about the fact that the products that they were selling, they were trying to addict us to, were going to kill us? Yeah, they lied. They lied to us. Were the food companies lying to us when they did everything possible to ensure the production of salty and sweet and fatty, because that's what we would buy more of for our short-term interests, and sell them in bigger and bigger quantities? Were they lying to? Yeah, they were lying to us. They're not taking care of us. They're treating us as products. They're treating us as things that are useful to them. And were there members of government that happily went along with that because they were on the payroll of those lobbies? Yes, of course. Absolutely. And I think that, like, my mom raising me, she was aware of that. She wasn't going to make a sophisticated argument. She wasn't going to develop a documentary, but at base level, she understood that the advertisements that we were seeing and the campaign speeches that we were digesting were not good for her kids. I think she fundamentally understood that, and she was angry about it. She accepted it. That's the way the system kind of worked, that they were all trying to screw each other. But she also recognized, and you said it yourself, how you were born in terms of class, as people that didn't have the education, didn't have the network, didn't have the money, that we were going to get screwed. That's not what America's supposed to be about. America's supposed to be the country where everyone can make it. That's what the American dream is. And fewer Americans believe in the American dream today. Now, that's accurate. It's harder to actually have upward mobility in this environment. People, a country that has been very optimistic, that historically large majorities of Americans, when polled, would say, I'm going to make it to the top 10%. And if I don't, my kids will. I mean, so many people saying that it wasn't conceivably true, but they believed it. And that made you happier. And it made you happy in part because you did kind of trust a lot of those people that were elites. And that has gone away, in my view. Absolutely, it has.
Do you think the same they lie to us about things like masks because they really believe that we have to get people to believe this to protect them?
I really really was disappointed with Fauci. I mean, it was pretty clear that he was marketing to Americans because he thought he knew better and that we couldn't handle the truth. And of course, when you do that in the near term and you find out in the long term, what that does is it helps the conspiracy theorists, right? I mean, it's true that there was a lot that Americans really didn't know about this disease in the early stages. But I mean, saying, hey, an N95 is the best thing to do, but we don't want you wearing those because we really need those for the people that are in, sort of critical hospital care and the rest. Like, I think that's what he should have said. I don't think he should have lied to Americans in the early days, because I think it did enormous damage, especially because of the political divisions in this country. I think the CDC has taken a massive hit of trust and has become politicized in the United States. And we need to be able to believe our doctors and our scientists. We need that. So yeah, I feel like Fauci. I've been to Fauci's office. I interviewed him a couple of times for my own show. And he's a very charismatic guy, and he's friendly, and he's smart, and he touches you when he talks. But I mean, his office was a shrine. I can't remember the last time I had seen an office that had so many commendations and photos with him and every political leader from every walk of life that he had, like on every wall, floor to ceiling. And, I've seen that, that the fact that you want to show off the fact that you have a lot of access can serve many purposes. And, if as long as you're focused first and foremost on content, first and foremost on the science. But I fear that at least the Fauci that I met was focusing more on the media, the attention, the brand, the power, and less on the outcomes. And I think that did a lot of damage. This is just my personal impression. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist, right? I'm just being honest with you and telling you what I think because you asked me the question. I mean, we went through this pandemic, and that should have been an opportunity for us to invest more in early stage warning and in education and in strengthening the World Health Organization, for example. And none of that happened. All it did was breed more mistrust. Now, thank God, we have some extraordinary scientists in the private sector, like in Moderna and like in Pfizer and others, that were able to develop vaccines like with incredible speed and are now using those technologies to do all sorts of new things that are helping us with cancer and Alzheimer's and you name it. But the government and the mistrust that average Americans, average citizens have in what the doctors are telling us, especially those that are like on TV and that have some level of, where the elite doctors that you're supposed to listen to. I think that you'll listen to your own GC, but you won't. I mean GP, but you won't listen to those guys. I think it's a horrible thing.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk to people about a lot is, hey, look, lying is a powerful tactic, but be careful, because if you use it, it will work sometimes, and then other times you will just become known as a liar. And when I look at the division that we're going through right now, and what is it, about this moment, and I can't speak to whether the rest of the world is falling prey to the same thing or not, but in a world where anybody can pick up their phone and live stream to the rest of the world, your lies are going to be found out terrifyingly fast, and that is going to absolutely erode your credibility. And on top of that, now you get into a position where there's just the level of disdain and distrust that people are going to have creates the level of animosity towards the government that we're seeing now. And that's where you get that powder keg, where all of a sudden a country which has a host of problems just all coming together at one moment really starts to be super unnerving. But when I look out at what I would want people to take away, because I'm very much an individualistic thinker in that I think at the level of the individual. So I'm not good at what you're good at, which is global geopolitics. Like you see how all the puzzle pieces add up. What I understand is the person. And so I will say, look, everybody, of course, you know that people are lying to you. It is a tool in everyone's arsenal, and the vast majority of humans are going to deploy that tool, even if only to make you feel like your ass doesn't look big in those jeans, right? It's just it is going to be used. So the thing that you can do is not be as gullible. I never thought I would be interviewing people on geopolitics, but once I started feeling like society is beginning to fray, and it's beginning to fray because people are not building their own internal model of what they believe the world is. They're letting the algorithms do that for them. They don't understand how they're being manipulated, and therefore they become easy to manipulate. And so the thing that I'm hoping to do with the show, because all I've ever wanted to do is empower people to make decisions that make their life better. And I suddenly realized that people really need to understand how the game works. Once you understand how the game works, hopefully you can stop being mad about it and just start doing something about it. But speaking of doing something about it, when you look at, so we've got two wars that are happening right now, one potential war in air quotes, because you've made it very clear you don't actually think that America's going to be in a hot civil war.
Right.
But how does this all play out? Like I've heard you talk about Ukraine is just going to have to accept that they are partitioned, but also it felt like you had some anxiety about Trump coming in and just being like, you're going to have to accept that you're partitioned. Um, what is the, oh man, you talk about the risk assessment that you guys do is based on fact, not preference. So knowing that you're not about to lay out your preference,
Yeah.
what do you think is the actual path forward
And this
for
also, I
both
mean, that last
Russia,
point,
Ukraine, and Israel, Hamas?
that last point just links so much with what you were saying before. Like, I have no problem with being wrong. At the end of the year, we go back and we see how we did on all this stuff, and we, see like how that affects when we do get stuff wrong. Why did we get it wrong? What lessons do we take away from it? But the authenticity is absolutely critical. I mean, for someone who's not a part of a political party and who travels all over the world, I feel like, 5, 10 years ago, I spent most of my time talking with and engaging with elites because I thought, well, those are the people with power, and that's going to have the biggest impact in affecting change. But in an environment, as you say, Tom, where so many people are being, driven by misinformation, becoming angry, becoming polarized, I feel like I have to spend a lot more of my time just talking to people, right? Just like being authentic about what's happening in the world. And, it's not easy to, sort of ball that up into pro-Trump or pro-Biden or pro-American or pro-anything, frankly, but we need more of that. We need people that are prepared to like meet people where they are, listen to them, and talk about what we think is really happening in the world. And it's okay if you don't agree with all of it, because it's not about agreeing, it's about understanding. That's all it is. And so there, you're right. I mean, I don't want Ukraine to be partitioned. I don't think it's fair. I mean, I'm an American. I support the underdog. Like, I like the 16 seed for March Madness. That's who I root for, right? And the Ukrainians, this little country that didn't have much of a military, and the Russians just invaded them, try to take out their leader. So I don't want them to have to lose their country, but it's going to happen. I mean, at the very least, I don't see the territory that Russia's occupying now. I see no way that they're going to be able to get it back. Now, no one's going to force them to accept that publicly, but the reality is they're having a harder time fighting. When they started the war, the average Ukrainian recruit was 26 years old. Today, it's the mid-40s.
Whoa.
I don't think they're going to be able to keep fighting for another couple years this way if the Russians, assuming the Russians keep piling and piling and piling, people at them. Russia's a much bigger economy. They have a much bigger population. And the Ukrainians are going to get more desperate. They already see that they're not getting the additional support from the US. They're running out of like ammo. They're running out of missiles. They still have air defense, which is really important. But so at a minimum, they're stuck with 18% of their territory that the Russians are occupying. And potentially, it could get a lot worse than that. Potentially, because the Russians have not said we're prepared to sit there. They're still able to attack Russian ships in the Black Sea. Russians can say, we're moving to Odessa. We're taking that. We're securing the Black Sea for ourselves. We're going to take more pot shots at the Ukrainian leadership until Zelensky's gone. And Zelensky might well go if he's not able to keep fighting. You already see the fraying of the Ukrainian political system, opposition to Zelensky from the mayor of Kiev, from the head of the armed forces, because things aren't going so well. So, I mean, the risk is that. The risk is that this war that the United States has taken the lead and has consolidated all of its allies to provide support for Ukraine. And Biden said, we will be there as long as it takes. And within months, he changes that to, well, we're going to do as much as we can. That is a very different message for Zelensky. It's also a very different message for the Europeans, the frontline Europeans, who are going to have to deal with Russian disinformation and infrastructure attacks and cyber attacks, and have all of these troops that are right there on their border. So this is a very dangerous thing. I don't think it's not World War III. It doesn't lead to Russia attacking NATO, but it could lead to NATO starting to fragment, becoming much weaker, especially if Trump becomes president. But even if he doesn't, if Biden is no longer able to provide leadership that the Europeans can rely on to ensure that Ukraine can defend itself, they're going to start falling apart on this stuff. So that's the Russia-Ukraine side. The Middle East side, it's kind of a different story, because here Israel, is the more powerful country. Like Palestine's not a country, but Israel's the more powerful player. They're by far the most powerful military player in the region, both offensively and defensively. Not to mention their 100 nukes that they've never formally admitted to, but they have. And so the question here is, to what extent is this war going to expand? Because a lot of people are getting angry, because there's an axis of resistance that the Houthis are leading, and they're continuing to take shots, including just a couple hours ago against like a British vessel this time around. And so you can't actually have shipping through the Red Sea, and the Americans are now hitting them in Yemen. And that's expanding as a separate kind of auxiliary war. And then you have the Iranians providing military support to militants in Syria and Iraq who are hitting American bases. And so far, there haven't been any American servicemen or women killed. But if they do, that's a red line. And the Americans will hit back very hard, and maybe Iran. And the Israelis are more likely to get involved in a war with the Iranians. They just engaged in strikes that killed 5 Iranian members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Syria. And the Iranians said, that's unacceptable. We're going to hit you back. So, Netanyahu knows if he leaves office, he's going to jail. So he'll do a lot to keep the war going. And the Americans are trying to get him out. So, I mean, there's just lots of ways that this can get worse, not to mention the fact that we're radicalizing millions and millions of Muslims around the world on the basis of all of this violence that is happening. So, I mean, this is a tough one. And by the way, just so we don't only have a negative conversation, I mean, the report is about top risks. So, of course, the bias is to focus on the risks. But there are ways that both of these wars could be resolved more sustainably. On Ukraine, if the Americans and Europeans take the assets that have been frozen of Russia and seize them and use them to rebuild Ukraine, helping Ukraine get into the European Union, which all 27 members approved, and the Americans and Europeans provide some hard security guarantees for the remaining 82% of the territory that Russia has, before, let's say, the 75th NATO anniversary happening in Washington in July, then nothing is going to make Ukraine whole. They won't get their land back, but the Ukrainians in that rump state will have a better future than they would have ever had before Russia invaded. Again, it doesn't make up for the war crimes and the Ukrainians dead and displaced. Nothing will ever do that, but Ukraine will have a future. That will be a win, ultimately, long-term for Ukraine. And with Israel and Hamas, I mean, the Saudis still want to normalize relations with Israel. Israel is in a very strong geopolitical position. If you can get rid of Netanyahu, who opposes a two-state solution, and you can degrade Hamas, and Israel will have a buffer zone with security inside Gaza, small, but they'll focus far more on defense than Netanyahu ever did. And they promise the Palestinians have the ability to get a state, even if they don't have an army. So the security will be provided by a multinational force funded probably by the Gulf states, but they'll get a state. They'll be able to govern politically West Bank and Gaza. And in return, the Saudis normalize their relations with Israel. And Israel becomes stronger and wealthier, and there is more peace across the region. Now, I don't, unfortunately, Tom, I don't think either of those are the baseline scenarios. And the timing, the window for those things to happen is narrow, right? Because the more the violence happens, the more the likelihood is that it spirals out of control. But both are possible. And even better, people involved in these conflicts at the highest levels know that these things are possible and are working to try to make them happen. So all is not doom, even when we talk about these two major wars that are causing so much hardship and sorrow
What do you think
in the
the
Middle
odds
East and
are?
Europe.
What do you think the odds are that the Israel-Hamas conflict spills outside of Gaza?
Oh, I mean, it's already happening, so that's 100%. Give me a narrower question that I can answer.
So do you think that the US is going to attack Yemen over the Houthis?
They've already done that. The Americans are now attacking Yemen directly, but they're not yet attacking the leadership by the time this comes out. So today is what? We're taping this on the 26th. So they may well start attacking the leadership by the time it comes out. That is on. The deterrence is not working, so it is escalating. The real question, I think, is what's the likelihood that the Americans and Iran start getting involved in a direct shooting war of some sort? Will there be American attacks on Iran? And also, will American servicemen and women get killed on the back of attacks that Iran is supporting? Those are the big tripwires. That's what gets you $150 oil, global recession. Trump becomes president no matter what in that environment, right? What's the likelihood of that? Let's put it this way. It's not 50%. It's not 5%. If I were handicapping it, I'd probably say right now 20. But it's gone up in the last 2 months because we've taken these incremental steps in the region that have brought us closer to that kind of conflict. That's I guess the best way I can say.
You can reboot your life, your health, even your career, anything you want. All you need is discipline. I can teach you the tactics that I learned while growing a billion-dollar business that will allow you to see your goals through. Whether you want better health, stronger relationships, a more successful career, any of that is possible with the mindset and business programs in Impact Theory University. Join the thousands of students who have already accomplished amazing things. Tap now for a free trial and get started today.
How do you see this playing out? So young people the world over seem very much to be on the Palestinian side, very much an aggressor victor mentality. They're going to take the side of the oppressed people as they perceive it, no matter what, right, wrong, indifferent, doesn't matter. You've got a bully I'm obviously generalizing, but you have that narrative playing out, and it's really captured the imagination of a lot of people around the world. Do you see that playing out where every day young people are gaining more power? Every day the governments are having to offer concessions to them. How does that play out in the U.S.? Because I have to imagine if the U.S.'s support of Israel faltered, that would have huge consequences in terms of how that plays out in the region. Do you think that read is right? Do you think anything like that could actually happen?
It is inconceivable to me that Biden would materially reduce support for Israel. U.S. supports about 12% of Israel's defense spend in peacetime. So it's important, but it's not existential. Biden is a pro-Zionist and has been for decades. So, I mean, he's personally very committed to the state of Israel, though he can't stand Netanyahu. That's a different story. There is a lot of reason for the U.S. to have that relationship that has nothing to do with this war. Intelligence sharing, for example, that's very important, and engaging in mutual efforts against would-be terrorist organizations, rogues, and the rest. I mean, that is Israel is not an unuseful ally to the United States. It's not all take. But you are right that the young people in the United States are much more strongly supporting the Palestinian cause, and that the Democrats are more inclined to support the Palestinians, not Hamas, but the Palestinians, than they are to support Israel. And that is new. And Biden is losing support, especially among Arab Americans, voters in states like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania. And that really matters, because in some of those states, the support he has lost is greater than the margin of victory he had in 2020, just from that constituency. So he knows this is a problem for him. So he wants the war to be over soon. Over. He at least wants it to move to a much lower intensity of day-to-day fighting. He's not calling for a ceasefire, but he is calling for a shift in operations. And he also doesn't believe that the Israeli government has a strategic goal in mind when they say destroy Hamas. They're trying to figure out, well, to what end? Like, what does it mean to destroy Hamas? And the Americans dealt with this after 9/11. It's a war on terror. What does it mean to win against terror, right? I mean, it's very hard to destroy an idea. And Hamas is as much a movement, a political movement, as it is a terrorist organization. And it's really hard to destroy. You can kill the leaders, though they haven't yet. But it's really hard to destroy Hamas and not have something come up that is just as problematic with even more supporters a year later or 3 years later. Now, I also understand that part of the reason that there's so much opposition to Israel is because there are just a lot more Muslims than Jews in the world. I mean, you've got well over 1 billion Muslims, and you've got 20 million Jews or whatever. I mean, it's just not, it ain't close. And I mean, you look at the algorithms in TikTok and you see what the young people are digesting on social media, and it's overwhelmingly pro-Palestine. It's overwhelmingly anti-Jewish, and anti-Semitism is a thing. And it was growing significantly even before all of this. And
Yeah, I saw you put out a report before October 7th that I was like, what? It had not made my radar. Why do you think it was going up before their response to the attacks?
I think social media was a big component of it. I think
Why
that
would social media, though, push an anti-Semitic stance?
Traffic in white nationalism, traffic in anti-Semitism, making it so much easier. You're not going to a physical meeting. You're digesting this information yourself. A lot of people don't want to do this sort of stuff publicly. You're making it so much easier for people to blame the Jews for stuff. People that might have some of those thoughts occasionally internally that they don't share, and suddenly they have a Reddit board that they can connect on. Suddenly they have memes that they can post and listen to. They have people they can follow. I do think that matters a lot. So, I mean, clearly, I think that's a big piece of it. And I mean, you look at, that crazy person behind the Tree of Life massacre, and what he was digesting. You look at, whenever you see the manifestos that are being put together by so many of these people that are engaging in mass shootings, and you find that their minds have been filled with this incredibly horrible disinformation, great replacement theory, and all of this stuff. And okay, it's not all social media. Well, I guess Tucker Carlson's on social media now, but before that, he was on Fox. He was part of it too. There were a lot of people that were trafficking in incredibly anti-human and truly dangerous information, and motivating angry young people to become far more toxic. I think that's what we're looking at.
Okay, so then I have a really simplistic take, but I think this is bulletproof on not how you get to um, stopping the current conflict between Israel and Hamas, but what the solution must be. I think by its nature, the following statement is true. The only way you're ever going to end that conflict is to create a situation where Palestinians have so much economic opportunity that they believe their children's future will be brighter than theirs. And I have a feeling, I have a belief, a base assumption that the way the human mind works, when you believe that to be true about your kids, all of a sudden your focus just goes to that. I'm going to help make sure that my kid's life is better. Now, when you believe that the only way to do that, because you don't have economic opportunity, is to kill the person that's holding you down, then all of a sudden the ideology of the religions and all that stuff comes into play, and you use that as a galvanizing force. But it actually isn't, thinking through this in real time, bear with me, everybody, that actually isn't the cause. That is the thing that you use to the story that you use to bring everybody together to galvanize on. But what's actually going on under the hood is that you don't believe your children have a future, and you need a thing you can do to get you that. And when the right answer is educate my kids, work really hard, give them an opportunity, you do that. When the answer is attack the person you believe to be the oppressor, then you do that. And so I read this book called Silk Roads. I don't know if you've read it. Man, you'd have a way better take on it than me. But it lays out a really fascinating look at history. And it goes to this period, I forget what years, but I think before 1000 AD, where Jews and Muslims got along just fine. And the way the author explained it, and forgive me, I'm forgetting his name, but the way he explained it was when a society is confident in its own identity and secure in its future, it's completely welcoming and tolerant. And it is only when it loses its sense of who they are, what they stand for, and they become insecure about their future, that now all of a sudden you need somebody to hate. Man, I really feel like that's right. Now, I get it that is so simplistic from a this is all we have to do. Doing it will be brutally difficult. But my thing is, if you put a plan on the table that does not involve economic opportunity, that allows people to really feel like, oh my God, if I really work, my kid's life will be amazing. If you don't do that, you will never solve this problem.
Yeah, I think that there were a lot of people that believed that the Middle East was getting resolved because Israel had peace and broke through with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, the Abraham Accords, and then the Chinese facilitated Iran and Saudi Arabia opening and normalizing. And then the fight that happened between Qatar and the UAE and the Saudis, the Gulf Cooperation Council splitting up, that got fixed. So, I mean, people were feeling, hey, the Middle East is like, we're seeing momentum, we've got peace. And of course, the problem was that those millions of Palestinians were feeling like everyone had forgotten about them. They had no future, no opportunity, hunger in Gaza, no proper education, no ability to travel, no ability to have a proper employment, certainly no opportunity for the kids. And in the West Bank, the Palestinians losing more and more and more territory illegally settled by the Israelis. And so, we may have stopped talking about the Palestinians, but the Palestinians didn't stop hurting. In fact, they were getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And that does not in any way justify anything that has happened in terms of Hamas. I mean, that the acts of October 7th were heinous, and Hamas is a terrorist organization, and I agree they should be destroyed. But it's not surprising that lots of Palestinians will turn to violence when they have no opportunities afforded to them and their children. So the future requires that the Palestinians have a place that not only they can govern, but that they can make lives for themselves. And that means the West is going to have to invest. And most importantly, the Gulf states who are super rich are going to have to invest, but the politics have to be made feasible for that investment to take place. And the Israelis have to have security that allows that investment to take place. So there are a lot of moving pieces, and there's a lot more incentive now for the Americans and the Gulf states and even a lot of Israelis to take that seriously in a way that everyone hadn't bothered. I mean, the Saudis were about to normalize with Israel before October 7th, and they didn't demand a two-state solution. They just wanted some window dressing. Let's just give the Palestinians some money, because the view was, hey, it's not urgent. So as long as we show our people that we care about the Palestinians, we don't have to fix anything. They're not saying that now. Now they're saying, no, we've actually got to do some serious work so that this doesn't happen again. Like the Saudis are saying never again, right? And that's important. So if you get everyone in the region saying never again, and they put their money where their mouths are, and they're willing to expend some political capital, then you have a solution. But let's also keep in mind that the Israelis have themselves been super radicalized by October 7th. A lot of those young people that were tortured and raped and killed were the most progressive. They were in a dance rave. These aren't the settler populations. These are the people that most wanted peace with the Palestinians. And now you killed them, and you killed their kids. And so they are super angry, and they are very strongly in favor of more military action against the radicals. And if a bunch of civilians get caught up in it, well, that's the fault of Hamas too. And the Palestinians, I mean, when you've done what you've done to them over the last 4 months, right? I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands that have been killed. We're talking about, over 1 million that have been displaced. I mean, you've leveled big pieces of Gaza, completely unlivable. It's going to take a long time to get over that. It's not just about investing in Gaza. It's also about finding a way to build trust, and connect bridges that have been completely blown up. So that's why I'm saying I think there is a path, but I don't pretend to be optimistic about that path.
Yeah. That makes
Ukraine
two of us.
too.
And
the Ukraine situation is very similar. Like, even if you give them a state that works and it's reconstructed, they're still going to hate the Russians for a very long time. And I mean, like, hate in a genocidal kind of way, hate the way the Armenians hated the Turks after the genocide, right? And that's when you radicalize that many people, that's a dangerous environment. Like, what's the likelihood that in 5 years' time, there's going to be an IRA type Ukrainian paramilitary organization that's just trying to blow up Russians? I think it's fairly high that that's going to happen, given what's just occurred over the last 2 years.
yeah, so then I share that concern. I try to be optimistic. I think things rarely work out as poorly as you fear they might. And so I will pose a question knowing that somehow, some way, I believe that we're going to avoid it. But I'd love to hear a thoughtful take. What are the potential guardrails that if you get Israel just will not back down, Ukraine, let's say Trump comes into power, Ukraine, it gets divided, NATO begins to back off because they realize the US is no longer going to be the big dog there. The Houthis keep going, and so we end up bombing directly Yemen. We get into an open conflict with Iran. China sees their opportunity to, if I don't know if he got elected or not, but I know that there was a pro-independence person running for election in Taiwan. Like, there are so many things on the table right now that speak to instability. What are the guardrails that stop us from ending up in World War III?
Well, I mean, first of all, one guardrail is that the Russians are very uninterested in getting into a fight with a NATO country directly. And that's how you get real conflict between nuclear armed powers. When, for example, when there was a rocket that went just across the Ukrainian border into Poland and killed 2 Polish villagers, I think they were farmers. It turned out that it was a Ukrainian air defense missile that misfired. But the Russians did everything they could immediately to show photographs and whatnot to say, hey, this wasn't us. This wasn't us. Where you can imagine the Russians who are angry that the Poles are facilitating all these weapons to be sent to Ukraine to use against Russians, might have said nothing, or might have even, said, well, so what? I mean, this is what happens if you're going to send all these missiles and kill our citizens. Then, you're basically a belligerent in the war. They didn't do that. They've been very careful not to get involved in a direct war against NATO. So, I mean, the lessons should be learned is Ukraine not in NATO. That's why they're vulnerable to the Russians killing them. It's why Finland and Sweden wanted to join NATO, is because they understand that actually means something, that after 2014, when the Russians came into Crimea, maybe the West should have responded more seriously than they did, So that's a guardrail. A second guardrail, the two most powerful countries in the world, US and China, really don't want a crisis. They just don't. They're trying very hard to keep any conflict limited from escalation. That's why you're seeing all the military to military engagement that has recently started up again. That's why since mid-October, the Chinese decided to stop with all of their near-miss overflight next to American aircraft that were doing exercises and freedom of navigation patrols off of the Chinese border in international airspace, avoiding the potential for direct conflict. Part of that is because the U.S. knows that they're dealing with two wars and they don't need any more fighting. Part of it is because China has economic problems and it is trying to ensure that not everyone leaves China in terms of investment. And geopolitically in Asia, they're driving a bunch of countries towards the United States on security: India, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea. I mean, all of these things. So I think that's a guardrail. But those guardrails do not prevent these wars from getting worse. They prevent World War III, but they don't prevent the wars from getting worse. So the U.S. conflict, U.S. versus itself in 2024, there's nothing preventing U.S. institutions from continuing to deteriorate. There's nothing stopping U.S. democracy from experiencing a much worse crisis. We don't have guardrails against that. Unfortunately, we should. We don't. There are no guardrails that are preventing Zelensky from losing power, for more of Ukraine being taken over by Russia. There are no guardrails right now that are preventing the war between Israel and Hamas from spilling over more broadly into the Middle East. So as much as I think the likelihood of global war is thankfully actually very low, the likelihood that these serious conflicts are going to continue to intensify is actually very high.
Yeah, that's very nerve-wracking, and I am reminded why you call this the Voldemort of years. So let me ask, if Trump gets elected, is that an existential threat to democracy?
I think that if Trump is elected, there will be a permanent amount of damage done to the U.S. political system that will be very hard to come back from. I do not believe the U.S. will become a dictatorship. I certainly don't believe we'll see civil war. But I think the U.S. political system will look more like something between Poland and Hungary. And what I mean by that is that rule of law will take a structural hit. The party in power will end up with structural advantages that will make it very hard for the opposition to come back. It will make it very hard to have free and fair elections that can be contested effectively. So right now, we can have a free and fair election, but the majority of American people have questions. And a significant minority of the American people think it's fake, the people that lose. But we can still have them. I think if Trump wins, there is a reasonable chance that it will be materially harder to have a free and fair election in the United States. I think that's a big problem.
Do you think that the government is being weaponized against Trump right now?
I think that there are some decisions that have been made that are politically unjust against Trump. I think that that does not describe a strategic effort of the Biden administration across the board. But for example, I believe that the felony case in New York on financial charges brought against Trump is an illegitimate case. And I've had that conversation with high-level Democratic attorneys who agree. A politicized case that would be a misdemeanor if it was a regular U.S. citizen, but because it's Trump, it has been raised to a felony. I think that is unjust. I think that is a weaponization of the U.S. judicial system against the former president. I think the Washington and Georgia cases are completely just and have merit. I think that there has been a level of disinformation against Trump from some political figures on the Democratic Party that run with headlines without doing research and then end up looking stupid as a consequence. And I think that, unfortunately, like if you've got 91 indictments and most of the cases legitimate, but one of them really isn't, that really hurts your ability to make the argument on the other cases. Like you said before, if you're caught in a lie once in this environment, people are going to mistrust you on all of those other cases, even though your reputation has been sterling in those other cases, right? I think that the Colorado decision, Supreme Court decision to try to throw Trump off the ballot, and Maine as well, I think was illegitimate. I mean, it'll be overturned in the Supreme Court, in my view. But I mean, Trump, whether or not you consider Trump an insurrectionist, he was impeached for insurrection. He was not convicted. That was overturned. And there are none of the indictments that he is presently facing are charging him for insurrection. So I don't understand what the taking him off the ballot. For me, that was politicized by the Colorado Supreme Court. And if I were a Trump supporter, that would seem unfair to me. That would seem like a witch hunt to me. That would motivate me to fight against these guys, right? But I also believe that Trump did everything he could to actually overturn a free and fair election. Did everything he could, and he failed. But if he could have succeeded, he would have succeeded. And I cannot, I mean, the fact, everything I just told you does not compare. These are not, apples and apples we're talking about. I mean, you've got a guy, the former president, that tried to overturn a free and fair election. That's foundational to American democracy. And in any well-functioning democracy, if that guy is trying to run for president and looks like he's going to win, that should be the number one issue you're discussing, right? Because that's a bigger deal than anything else. Bigger deal than the economy. It's a bigger deal than the border. It's a bigger deal than abortion. It is literally the biggest deal in a well-functioning democracy. There's only one problem, and that is that the United States is not a well-functioning democracy. So it is not the biggest deal. because people don't think it's the biggest deal. That's a problem. They don't value the facts or the democracy the way they need to.
Yeah, that's a big can of worms with in terms of what we value. Do you think that when Nixon was caught doing something illegal, that the way that they handled that by pardoning him so the country could move on was the right answer?
Yes, absolutely. And I would hope that if Biden wins and Trump is going to jail, that he would pardon Trump. I think that would be the right thing to do for the country.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I only have the question. I don't have an answer, but I will just say off ramps, everybody, off ramps. Whether you're talking about Putin, whether you're talking about the Palestinians, gotta have them, gotta have them.
Yep.
Ian Bremmer, it is always a pleasure. Where can people follow you?
They can follow me, Ian Bremmer, on Twitter, g0media.com, with like our regular newsletter that comes out every morning. You can see it and subscribe. Anywhere, any other friendly social media site. If you look me up, you'll probably find me someplace.
I love it, man. Thank you so much for taking the time. Everybody, if you have not already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace.
If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
When I hear people say it doesn't feel like World War III has started, World War II, when it started, also didn't feel like World War II had started for America. If you recall, America didn't get involved in World War II until after all of Europe had basically been in